We are going to learn how to use Bubble's API connector to integrate with OpenAI to create a recipe app. I'm excited to introduce our instructor, Sam Morgan, who is a Bubble developer on the team that builds Bubble.io. Sam, would you like to say a few words about the class you're teaching today?
Sure, thanks, Nicole. It's great to be here. Like Nicole said, I'm Sam. I'm a Bubble developer on the product team here at Bubble. In this session, we're going to be talking about APIs and specifically the OpenAI API, which allows us to use the functionality of ChatGPT to power our app. So for this use case, we're going to be building a recipe generation app where we send some user data to the API, and in return, we get a fully generated recipe powered by ChatGPT. So it should be a really cool session. So with all that said, let's go ahead and dive into the video. Hey everyone, my name is Sam. I'm a Bubble developer at Bubble, and today we're going to be diving in and building a recipe generation app. Let's get started. So I'm going to use a floating group for my header, mainly so that as our recipes grow and expand down the page, our content stays pinned to the top. Give it a minimum height of 60, expand it, there we go. I'm also going to create a little bit of contrast on my page background. I like to set my page background to some kind of gray just so that the header sticks out a little bit. And then we'll go ahead and start just putting in some of our basic UI elements. So I'm going to want a logo. We'll just call this My Recipes. Make it a little bit bigger. Give it a nice primary color. Maybe I'll do one button on the other side for a future feature that we may not get to in today's session, where we just store our recipes. Make that look a little bit nicer. There we go. Let's also center it. Let's make it bold and primary. Then I'm just going to use, to put this to the other side, I'll use my row layout here, space between. Then we'll add a little bit of padding to our header so that things kind of stand apart. I just want to add a page content group. And so to do that, we're going to just drag a group onto the page. And then I just want to make sure that I give it enough top margin to clear my header. So here it's 104 pixels. I'll go ahead and make this group column and then give it 104 top margin like that. We'll go ahead and expand it so it takes up the whole page. And then we'll also give this some padding just so that as we scale down, we don't hit the edges of the screen. Beautiful. And now finally, I'm just going to put in a little content card that will allow us to put like our input and our recipe on it, right? So here, let's go ahead and say that this is a column. I'm going to give it like a max width of like 528 and center it. That's just an arbitrary number I chose. You can really set any max width you want. I generally wouldn't go above something like 1130, which would be like a very widescreen sort of UI. But here, 528 seems fine for just a little input and our recipes below it. I'm also just going to give this card a little bit of style. So I'll go to group border, and you can see that I have this as just a flat white color with some border roundness here. And so that's going to kind of give us this nice looking card, right? Now we can go ahead and insert our input, and this is going to say, what do you want to cook? Right? We'll go ahead and also insert a button that says generate recipe. Let's go ahead and group these in a row so that they're next to each other. And then just a couple aesthetic changes to make things look really nice. And let's go back to this group and give it a bit of gap spacing. Here we go. So now we have an input and a button, and then the last thing we want is just a text placeholder for our recipe. I say placeholder because we haven't hooked up any AI functionality yet, and so there's really not much we can do to actually get the real recipe back yet until we hook up that functionality. So we'll just put in a little text element that will kind of hold the place of where our recipe will go. Let's also give this some gap spacing so the recipe is down. And then finally, just some padding on our card. Let's do our same 24 all around. Just a quick voiceover in terms of why I'm choosing 24. Just a number that I like from the Bootstrap system. It doesn't really matter which number you pick, but stay consistent. That's kind of the key thing. If you're using 24 padding in one place, it's probably going to look good for you to use that same padding somewhere else. There's all sorts of best practices online for this type of stuff. Okay, so we have our main input, our button, and our recipe text, and now we're ready to actually start hooking up our AI functionality. So we're going to be using OpenAI to connect an AI to our app. This AI is going to take the user input And then when they click generate recipe, it's going to return a recipe based on that input, right? That's our goal. So in order to do that, we need to use OpenAI. And the first step is going to be to browse OpenAI's documentation. I already happen to have it open, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up the documentation here. When you first look at this, if you're not used to APIs, it's going to seem very, very intimidating. There's a lot to look at, a lot to read, and this code that obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us right away. So one thing I want to just highlight is that almost all APIs will have this type of code called curl, and Bubble actually allows you to import this code and turn it into a call in our API connector, which is very, very useful. So to help learn this, what I want to do is import this call and start talking through some of the pieces of what makes up the API call. I want to point out a couple things here. We're using the chat completion call from OpenAI. I'd say for about 90 to 95% of text-based generations that you're going to be doing with AI, this is the call that you would use if you're using OpenAI. There are other endpoints for things like images and audio, but for the most part, for text-based generation, you're going to be using the chat completion object, right? And so what we're going to do is just copy this curl code, right? So I just hit the copy button. And then over in our Bubble editor, we're going to go ahead and add an API connector to our plugins, right? And so with this API connector, we can now hook up to the OpenAI chat completion call. So I'm going to add another API, and I'm going to call it OpenAI. I'm going to leave the authentication to none for right now because we're actually going to handle the authentication in the call itself. I'm going to, instead of expanding this and working on this blank call here, what I'm actually going to do is just click this import another call from curl link. And that's going to allow me to paste in the code that I copied from over here. And when I do that and hit import, it's going to actually bring all of that information into my API connector as a call. And this will allow us to kind of go through this and see what everything's doing. So what I'm going to do is just delete this default blank call. And now we're just left with this imported call. Let's rename it chat completion. And let's just talk through some of what's going on here, right? So one of the first options I have is to use as either data or an action. Here we want to select action. Basically, the difference between these two is depending on what you select, your API that you're setting up can either be available for use as part of the expression builder via the get data from an external API data source in the expression builder, or it can be used as a workflow action itself. Here, I'm going to want to use it as a workflow action because we're going to make this call when the user clicks the generate recipe button. The next part of my API connector is the data type, where I'm going to leave it set to JSON. That is a very, very common data type, and most APIs you connect with will be JSON. And then we have this post and a URL, and this comes directly from the API documentation. This is exactly what they want us to do here, right? They want us to post to this URL. And so that's been brought in here. And then we have these headers, right? The headers. So for our headers, those are actually coming from here in the curl code, right? You can see content type, application JSON, and authorization bearer, and then your API key. It is important to make both of these headers private. That will just prevent them from being exposed to users. And especially the API key one, that's sensitive information, so we want to make sure that that's private. And then for the API key, what you want to do is just grab an API key from your OpenAI account. And you're going to want to do that by signing up for an account here. And then you'll be able to access a section where you can create API keys. I'm going to go ahead and copy mine on another screen and paste it in here. So here's my API key. I'm just going to replace this variable. Notice I left in the bearer. That's very important. The format should be bearer and then your key. Okay. And then body type is still going to be JSON. And then we get down to this actual body content, which is kind of just a direct copy of this code over here, right? And so what this body content is saying is a couple things. First, it's defining our model, right? Here we're using GPT 3.5 Turbo. You can update this to GPT-4 if you have access to that API. Honestly, for our purposes, GPT 3.5 is a bit cheaper, and it will work just as well. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it on this. And then we have this messages object, right? And so this messages object contains two different messages. One is a system message, and the other is a user message. So in the system message, we are telling the AI how we want it to behave. So here, because this isn't really going to be changing, I can just statically type this, right? So I might say something like this. right? So something very, very simple. You're a helpful recipe generation wizard. You'll take a user input and generate a recipe based on what they ask for, right? I may give it some additional instructions here, like make sure to include information about ingredients, measurements, and steps to complete the recipe, right? Just so that every recipe that comes back is full and consistent in format. And now I have my user message. And this is what's actually going to change every time, right? Our user message is going to completely depend on what our user types into this input. And I can call this input recipe request, right? So whatever is in input recipe request, that's what we want to send to the API. And in order to do that, we need to make our user message dynamic, right? So our user message has to be able to be changed out with every call. And in order to do that, we're going to use this opening bracket and closing bracket for dynamic values. So I'm going to copy the user message, including the quotes, and I'm going to just put an open bracket and then say user underscore message, and then a closing bracket. And when I do that, you notice that I get a parameter generated down here called user message. And I can now fill this in with a message for initialization, right? Notice that I included the quotes around here, and we're going to talk in a little bit about why I pulled the quotes out of this section and into this section. It'll make sense, I promise, when we get to that part of the demo. So a couple things here. We want to make sure this is not private because our users need to be able to access this to change it out. And then we also want to initialize it with something that kind of makes sense. So maybe I'll say, I want to cook chicken tonight, right? I have my quotes in there, my user message. So now we should be able to initialize our call. Let's see if this works. It's going to take a minute, and there we go, right? We get back our recipe. So the message content says, great. So it's asking us, how would you like to prepare the chicken? There may be delicious recipes to choose from, such as baked, grilled, fried. Now, we're not building an app where the user can continue this conversation. So we need to be really clear in our system message that we don't want it to do this. We don't want it to ask questions, right? So I can fix that, right? If I go back here and I just add some information to our system message, I can tell the AI and say, the user may not give you enough details. If that is the case, you should be creative and suggest a delicious recipe and provide the details anyways, right? And maybe I'll be explicit. Do not ask follow-up questions. Just generate a recipe, right? And so now if I try to initialize this with the exact same information, hopefully we get an actual recipe back instead of a question from the AI. Let's see. There we go. So our AI says now, great, how about trying a classic recipe for chicken parmesan? Here's what you'll need. And it goes right into the recipe. That is awesome, right? So that's exactly what we want. We'll go ahead and hit save. And then, yeah, so our API is set up, and now we're ready to connect it to our UI on the front end. So again, what we want to do is take the user input and send that user input into the user message parameter, which should in turn return a nice recipe for us to then display. So let's take a look at how that's going to work. When our users hit the generate recipe button, what we want to do is first make that call to OpenAI. And I can find that call in my plugin section of the workflow actions. And this is because I selected action in my API connector. Then under user message, I can simply replace the default with a reference to the user's input, right? And so here I can say input recipe requests value. Now remember, I mentioned that we're going to address those weird quotes and why we pulled the quotes out of the body and into the parameter. And it's because there's a funny variable here where we don't exactly know what our users are going to type. And it's possible that they might use characters that are not what's called JSON safe. And JSON safe just means these characters can be sent over the API. So some examples of characters that are not JSON safe include things like quotes, and forward or backslashes, asterisks sometimes, right? And so we don't have any way of knowing if our user is going to include any of these forbidden characters. And so there's a bubble operator called formatted as JSON safe, which will automatically escape any of those invalid characters and turn them into valid characters if they exist. But the catch is that this formatted as JSON safe operator also adds quotes to the outside, right? And so if we left the quotes in our body, we would end up with double quotes, which itself would return an error, right? And so we want to get rid of them so that the formatted as JSON safe takes care of them for us. That's the whole reason behind that setup. So we've made our call to OpenAI. And now what we want to do is display OpenAI's response somewhere. We need to save it somewhere. Here I'm going to use a custom state. You could also save it to the database. There's a lot of different ways that you could handle this, but I'm just going to use a custom state on the page. We'll create a new state called AI response. It'll be a text value. And what we're going to do, the way that we're going to access this response is by saying the result of step one's choices, first items, message content. Now, this may seem like a strange expression, but if we look back at our API response, it'll start to make sense. OpenAI sends us back an object, and one of the top-level properties of that object is this choices property. Now, choices, what you see when you see the square bracket, that means that this is a list of choices, right? The square bracket stands for an array in JSON, and that means that this is a list. And so that's why we say choices first item, because there could be more than one choice, and we're just going to take the first option that the AI sends back. So choices, first items, and then you have another property underneath choices called message, and then another property underneath message called content, and that's where the actual response is stored. And so that's why we have the expression, the result of step one's choices, first items, message content is going to be displayed in that custom state. Then all we really need to do is just update our recipe text to reference that AI response or that custom state. And that way, when the state is set, our recipe will just display right here. And that's pretty much it. We now have a functioning recipe generation app. So let's take a look at what it looks like. I'm going to go ahead and hit preview. And let's try to generate a recipe. So let's say I'm in the mood for salmon tonight. And in just a second, we should have our recipe back. There we go. It says, great, here's a delicious recipe for honey glazed salmon. So that is some pretty cool functionality that we set up pretty quickly. There's a lot that you can do with this, right? We can continue, we can add a loading state. We can add a save button to save your recipes, right? And we have this My Recipes button up here. So there's a lot that we can do to expand on this, but this is the basic functionality of a recipe generation app. One thing I can show real quick at the end here is how you would create this save functionality so that you can save recipes like this to the database, right? And so what I would do is back here, I'd probably add a new data type called saved recipe, right? And here I'd probably just save the recipe itself. So I'd have the recipe text, right? And then that recipe would automatically have a creator field, so we'd know exactly who created it. We probably want to somehow save the title as well. And so what I'd do is just create a recipe title field. And instead of text, just to be more clear, let's call it a description, or actually instructions, right? I can then come back to my UI and add a new button below the recipe that says Save Recipe. And when the user clicks that, what we're going to do is create a new saved recipe, right? Now, there's one interesting thing here, which is that at this point, remember, when we generate the recipe, we clear out the input. So we don't really have a title for the recipe yet. We just have the recipe text, and we kind of lost the user's input. And even then, the user's input wasn't necessarily the right title for the recipe. So one thing we could do that's really cool is actually use AI to generate the title based on the recipe, right? So when we click Save Recipe, we're going to first make a call to that chat completion endpoint, right? Now, what we are going to need to do is actually have another endpoint because we're not going to be generating a recipe with this, right? We have our static text in here. So there's a couple things we could do. I could make this text dynamic, or I could create another call. In this case, I'm going to make the text dynamic. So what I'm going to do is just copy this, and I'm going to actually use the command X to cut it. And then I'm going to put in system_message like this, right? And then I'm going to paste that in the initialization and uncheck private so we can change out this system message. And then I'll reinitialize the call. And by doing that, we've made it so that we can now change what we're instructing the AI to say. And so now I need to go back, and in my generate recipe workflow, you notice I still have the default here. So this is fine. That's exactly what I want to leave here, right? But now this gives me the opportunity to do another call where I change that message. And here, instead of your helpful recipe generation wizard, what I want to say is take the user input and generate an appropriate title for the saved recipe. right? So we're going to submit the recipe text and say, give me a title for this recipe. And so then the user message is actually going to be the recipe's text, right? So here I can actually reference that custom state, right? So indexes AI response, and then we're also going to format that as JSON safe, right? And so it's going to sort of generate a title for this, and then I can save the title by saying the result of step 1, choices, first items, message content. And then my recipe text, right, the instructions are actually just going to be indexes AI response, right? And so we've now just saved a recipe to our database by using the same call to generate a custom title, right? So lots of things that you can do with this. That's going to be all the time we have for this demo. Yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed learning how to build an AI app with Bubble.
To get the ball rolling, I have a question for you, Sam. In this recipe app, you set the API call to be an action. What are some common use cases for setting an API call to be data as opposed to an action?
Yeah, great question. So data calls, generally you want to think about if you're going to need to use the call as part of a workflow or not. So a great use case for a data call would be anything that you really just need to show on the front end of your app and you don't need to actually do any processing with, right? So let's say you're making a call to an API to get a list of data to display on the front end. That'd be a great use case to just set it up as a data call and make that call inside of a repeating group. As soon as you need to use the call as part of an action and reference the result of a certain step in a workflow, that's when you'd want to use an action.
Awesome. That's really helpful context. I'm seeing a question about any limitations that might exist with using AI in Bubble. Do you mind elaborating a bit on that?
Sure. This is pretty general, but in general, there's no limitations to what AIs you can use. It's really, we connect to AI using the API connector. So as long as the AI service has API endpoints or uses a REST API, you have the same capabilities on Bubble that someone using native code would have. What Bubble isn't is we're not a platform for fine-tuning a model on our servers, but an API is a third-party service that you can connect to and use the model that they have fine-tuned to generate results and return those results back to your Bubble app. So in that sense, there's really no hard limitations. It would be limited by if a certain service doesn't have an API, you wouldn't be able to connect to it, but you could say that those services likely don't want to be connected to in the first place if they don't have an API.
Fantastic. It looks like your answer probably just touched on a bunch of the questions that were in the chat. I am seeing one about users who are looking to create a custom trained model and wondering how to connect that using the API connector. Would the steps be really similar to what you just showed us? Or what would the differences
Yeah,
be?
this is a great question. So one thing I wasn't able to cover in my video, we talked about the chat completion endpoint, right? And so this is a great API endpoint that OpenAI provides for simple, call and response type AI use. So in our case, we sent a message to the AI that asked for a certain recipe, and the AI sent us back that recipe. As soon as you start talking about context and you want the AI to remember things, or you want the AI to have awareness of, say, your data or some document that you upload, there's actually another API that I would recommend. It's also by OpenAI, so you'd be using the same documentation, but you would want to look at the documentation for something called the Assistance API. This is a more recent release by OpenAI. Before the Assistance API was out, you would have had to use something called fine-tuning, which was a lot more complex. The Assistance API makes this much more accessible. Basically, it provides a couple of extra endpoints where you can send image data, you can send file data, and work with more file types to provide the AI context. And then it has a mechanism for automatically remembering all that context in subsequent calls. So it's really great. It would be a whole other lesson and video in and of itself to go through the specifics of the Assistance API, but definitely check out the documentation, and it's definitely possible to hook up to that API through using Bubble.
Amazing. That's a really helpful tip. I'm also seeing a question about how a user would go about generating images or audio based on a description, because in this app that you just built, the recipe comes back as just text. So what advice would you give to a user who's looking to generate something other than just text?
Yeah, great question. So OpenAI provides another service called DALL-E, which is image generation. So it's not the only option, by the way. There are several different image generation services. There's Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, a couple others that are coming out. But I really like OpenAI. I think their API documentation is great. So they have one called DALL-E. One just caveat to keep in mind when generating images, and I think a lot of people get surprised by this when they start using AI image generation in their apps. It's not super cheap, and you want to make sure that the use case you have for generating images is worthwhile and that you have some sort of monetization plan, because it can quickly, if you're generating a lot of images, OpenAI is going to charge you for that use. In terms of audio, I would recommend there's a separate company, not OpenAI, called 11 Labs that does a great job with audio generation. I actually saw somebody at the Bubble House last year in Spain make a Bubble app using 11 Labs that allowed me to speak in my normal English voice, and it played back the message in my voice, but in Spanish. It was a really unbelievable use case of 11 Labs. So they have a great API, definitely worth checking out if you have some time.
Those are some really helpful pointers. I'm also seeing a question about how users might be able to provide multiple inputs. So I think some of our users who are building apps are thinking about the UI and how a user would go about providing inputs and then getting something generated in return. And so if they are completing something more like a form and providing multiple inputs like chicken, fried, and dinner, how could they go about incorporating those inputs to then generate a more specific user message?
Yeah, awesome question here. So I think this question was asked before the end of my video. And so you may have gotten a peek into the answer when you saw how I replaced the system message with a dynamic parameter. So the answer to this question is yes, you definitely can have multiple user inputs. You can customize this prompt to have as many user inputs as you want. The key is just using the open caret character and the close caret character to surround your dynamic parameter name. And that will create a new parameter underneath in the API connector for you to work with. You want to make sure that you're structuring things as that JSON safe, using that formatted as JSON safe operator, because every dynamic input that you create, the user has the potential to put not safe characters in there, like backslashes or quotes. So on the front end, just make sure you're using that formatted as JSON safe operator, and you will be good to use as many inputs as you need to.
Fantastic. What would you say are common pitfalls that you've seen when using APIs in Bubble? Because it's clearly a really powerful feature that a lot of our users take advantage of. So curious if you could elaborate on some pitfalls.
Great question. There are a few. The biggest one that comes to mind is honestly, and it's honestly just not staying patient enough, and not recognizing that this stuff is not supposed to be easy, and there's no quick solution to a lot of times the solution to hook up a specific API is to read the documentation over and over again until you find what you're looking for. And I know that may seem like kind of a cop-out answer, but it's really true. These APIs are complex, and there's no one size fits all. Every API is different from the last. So what we saw with hooking up OpenAI is going to be different if you try to go to 11 Labs and use their API, right? The best piece of advice I can give is to use that import curl functionality that we saw to teach yourself about the different functionalities of the API connector. Another just common pitfall too is just not getting authorization right. So authorization is just basically your username and password credentials. Sometimes there's no username and it's just a password. Other times there's both. But authorization meaning your credentials for being allowed to use the API. This is a pretty complex subject that varies from API to API. And so because of that, a lot of times people get used to one authorization method and then they try an API that uses something different and don't necessarily switch things up. But again, that goes back to the API documentation will be very clear about what the authorization should look like. So the more details you can read in the documentation, the more likely you are to get things right and set it up correctly.
Absolutely. And I would highly encourage that our users check out Bubble documentation as well, because we do cover some of this for the most popular API services out there. I'm also seeing a question in the chat. I think our users are really appreciative of all your knowledge on this topic and are wondering if you have any recommendations for good custom AI training platforms that do offer an API that they could connect to Bubble.
Great question. So I'm going to go back to the assistance API as the easiest way to do this. There was a service before the assistance API came out called Pinecone that was really great. And there was this sort of moment in AI development, again, before OpenAI kind of changed this moment with the release of the assistance API, where in order to store context, you were sending things to what's called a vector database. And that would allow you to sort of fine tune the model and have it remember certain context, or maybe you wanted to train it on, your entire product's manual, right? This stuff is all much easier now with the assistance API. So I would recommend that like the best way to get started with training and creating like a very custom implementation. If you're thinking stuff like custom GPTs, the assistance API is basically the API version of a custom GPT, where you can upload as much context as you want, and the AI will remember all of that context.
Very cool. I think we have time for one more question about error handling. How do you go about error handling and checking that the response is coming back in the right way? Any advice around debugging?
Yeah, great question. So there is a checkbox in the API connector. I think it says something like include errors as part of the response. So you definitely want to make sure that's checked. Once that's checked, I didn't cover this in the video because there wasn't a ton of time to get through everything. But once that's checked, what's going to happen is you'll be able to reference the results of whatever the step is that you called the API in your workflow. And there'll be a parameter called has error. And that parameter will come back as either yes or no. And so what I usually do is I'll set up a custom event, on the same page or backend workflow, wherever I'm calling the API, there'll be a custom event called handle error. And after I call the API, I trigger that custom event only when the results of the API calls has error is yes. And then you can also put, on all the steps that continue with the workflow, only if has error is no. So you basically branch off your workflow into two different paths based on that parameter that comes back. A lot of times for an error, I'll show just a custom pop-up and say, hey, there was an error, please reach out to the team. There's a lot of different ways you can actually handle the error, but that would be the basic technique in the workflow.
Awesome. Well, Sam, thank you for walking us through how to build an AI-powered recipe app. Bubble's API connector truly opens up a world of possibilities, and OpenAI is only one of many services you can connect your app with.